Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. And today we're doing an outside walk-in podcast here with John Bocskay. And we're here at the UN Memorial Cemetery. So, John, as a start, I might get you to introduce yourself, if that's okay, and let the listeners understand where we are and who you are.
Great. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm the Director of International Affairs here at the cemetery. And what that fancy title means, what I actually do is I'm the liaison with the embassies that manage and oversee the cemetery. There are 10 foreign embassies, as well as help coordinate any member state or sending state visiting delegation from abroad, which we have several a year. Coordinate events, commemorations, visits, burials. Occasionally we have disinterments. I can talk about all that stuff later.
We'll get to it, yep.
So that's my role here. I've been here a little over 3 years. I love working here. It's a beautiful place, as you can see. Your listeners, unfortunately, might accompany the podcast with a couple of photos. It's just a very meaningful place, and I really enjoy working here. Very good colleagues, and everyone who's sort of involved in managing this place takes it very seriously and is very proud of what we do. So that's in a nutshell.
All right. And for listeners, I will attach a map in here because we're going to walk around the grounds as we do this, and I'm also going to attach some photographs as well. So hopefully that will all make things a little bit more clear where we're going and what we're talking about. So as a start, where are we? So we're at the top here of a gradual hill that rolls down, and we're in Busan, of course. As you said, it's solemn and like as you would expect, but it's also quite beautiful, quite peaceful. So just where are we now and where will we be heading down? So run us through the grounds of what we're looking at.
Right. So we're standing right in front of the UN flag at the very top of the cemetery. This area is called the Symbolic Area. This is where the flags of the 22 sending states are all flown. And there are some graves here as well, as you can see. This was the first part of the cemetery that was laid out. You can see in kind of a grid. And the cemetery was created during the war, so it was very much an active wartime cemetery. So it grew and it extended further down the hill where we have more graves. They initially set aside a lot of land. This in 1951, when this was created, this was really far outside what was then the city of Busan. It was very rural. There was none of this development or building. So this was really just empty space. The Korean government said to the UN command, here you go. They wanted to create this sort of consolidated cemetery for all the UN troops who were being killed in the war. Now, of course, as you can see, we're very much in the heart of Busan. It's almost the geographical center of the city. We have apartments all around us, and as the cemetery has developed, that's created other challenges because as you're familiar with Korea, there aren't cemeteries in the centers of cities anywhere in Korea, so it's a unique place in that regard as well, and creates another set of special challenges and considerations that I'd be happy to talk more about.
Absolutely. So before we do jump into all the details, we should just explain why there is a UN cemetery dedicated to the Korean War. Now, many people listening will know exactly what we're talking about here, but some people won't. So this was the first UN action ever, and this was an action it's often spoken about in terms of American-led, which it was, but this is a UN action, so of course this is a UN cemetery. So I might get to start with some of the details of the UN involvement here and why this is such an important moment for the UN as well.
Right. Well, as you said, this was a UN action. It was led by originally U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, and then later his successor Matthew Ridgway, who created this cemetery. It's important to understand. I like to explain to people when they come the context of the war at the moment the cemetery was created, and partly it's helpful in understanding how it came to be here and why it came to be at all. This cemetery, they began working on it in January of 1951, which during the Korean War that winter, beginning I think around late October of 1950, that was when the Chinese entered the war. And up until that point, from September, when MacArthur had cut them off in Incheon, had sort of sent them in retreat, there was this real sense of optimism that the war was going to be over. We had them on the run and so on. In late October, November, that changed. The Chinese entered and started pushing them back. But it's in the months of September and October when the UN forces were advancing. There were lots of battles along the way, and they created several cemeteries around the peninsula. And most of them would have been in what's now North Korea. And then when they were forced to retreat, then those cemeteries were lost. They had to be abandoned. Yep. So it was with that in mind that they created a cemetery here. Busan, I think, I don't know this from the record, but my assumption's always been that, one, because it was so far from the lines, there was no risk of it ever being captured or lost. And the other thing, just logistically, I mean, it's a port city. It's easy to transport people in by ship, by rail, by any means. So it just made good sense for them to put it here. And as I mentioned, this was a rural area at that time. It wasn't anywhere near the city center, such as it was then. So that's good to recall. They wanted to create, I think, a UN cemetery because it depending on the national policy of each country. It was the policy then, and is still in some cases the policy now, to have soldiers buried close to the place where they fall in battle. So that's why, for example, we have a lot of British soldiers here. That was the policy then. I'm not sure if it's the policy now, but New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians all had the same policy. And a little bit of trivia for your listeners: it was actually a U.S. policy when the Korean War started. That was also the U.S. policy, was to bury soldiers close to where they fell, and there were a lot of war casualties buried here, Americans. And that changed actually during the Korean War. The Korean War was when Americans started to repatriate their war dead, and that actually began around the time this cemetery was created. They started repatriating Americans who'd been killed in action back to the United States. But initially they were buried here. Many of them were later exhumed and repatriated to the United States.
So a question from that. Why there are plenty still of American graves, or I can see the American flag, and there are a lot of American graves. So, what is the significance of the remaining American graves at the site here?
Right. Yeah, as you mentioned, we have currently 39 Americans buried here, and the reason I say currently is that number grows slightly. We're actually planning a burial right now of an American veteran who settled in Korea when he retired, Korean War veteran, who recently passed away. So we have 2 or 3 burials a year. That number will grow over the years. The Americans buried here, you'll see some of these stones are quite a bit older. They're not very recent. The Americans buried here are all veterans of the Korean War. Why don't we step a little closer?
Let's walk
I'll show you some of the dates. Yeah. So these were all veterans of the Korean War. I don't know their individual stories. A few that I've been able to glean little details, but many of them were guys who settled in Korea after the war. Mm-hmm. They retired here, made their homes here. And, they died of all sorts of causes, natural causes. You can see this gentleman died in 1970, and then the next 74. The earliest, I think, began in the early 60s. 61, I think, was the first. And the rules also allow, like the conditions that define the eligibility for burial here, according to the original agreement as it was laid out, was that anyone who died in the service of the UN command is eligible to be buried here. Okay. So that's true today. Like if a soldier were to be killed or were to die for any reason in Korea, hit by a car in Itaewon, they could be buried here if they wished, if the family wished, or if there were no other, location. So that was the case with some of these guys too. There was one guy I pulled up a little bit of his record, and he was killed by a gunshot wound in Itaewon in 1961, which of course raised about
1961.
1961, died by gunshot wound in Itaewon, Seoul, Korea, and that's all I know.
And for people unfamiliar about Korea, there are no guns in this country. It's very hard to come across anything like that.
It was a very intriguing little tidbit that I wish I knew more about. I'm sure there's a great story there somewhere, but. So for any reason, as I said, if any of the Americans who happened to be serving here died, they're buried here, or in many cases they retired here. They married Koreans, they met their wives here during the war years or later, and then made Korea their home.
Do you get any repatriation the other way? Do you get any people dying overseas that wish to come here? Is that possible either?
Oh yeah, sure. We've had a few now. in an area down below, which I'll show you a bit later, we've created a separate area for now veterans from any sending state. The Americans, they started burying here years ago, I think, just because they started having requests, long ago. But about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, we started getting requests from other veterans from other nations. I think the first was a gentleman from France and another gentleman from England, veterans who wanted to be buried here. And so it was discussed, the rules, the eligibility requirements were expanded. And that began in 2015. So we have another area there. So in most cases, there are people who, lived overseas. They went back home to their home countries after the war, died there, and then were brought here. The remains were brought here by their families and buried. I think all except one or two. There was an American buried last year who actually lived in Busan. Okay. Which it's crazy. I've lived in Busan for 20 years. I never met the guy. I never heard about him. And there's a Korean War veteran living like down the road from me. That's somehow, we never crossed paths. But he was one of the exceptions. But for the most part, they lived overseas and came from overseas.
So this is a fairly unpredictable job in many ways. You can't tell what's going to happen or who's going to want repatriation until, that final moment in some sense.
Yeah, you don't know. I mean, we get emails now. I mean, the rules, as I mentioned, they expanded to allow veterans. They also expanded to allow spouses of both veterans and of war dead. We've had cases of widows who lost their husbands, 60 plus years ago, who are buried alongside their husbands now, and a couple more on the list who are still living. There was another issue that just recently came up where a Ptsd veteran, and Ptsd refers to the Korea augmentation to the U.S. Army. Okay. And these were Korean soldiers who were attached to U.S. units during the war. My understanding is to fill gaps, in units that were undermanned. And they also played an important role in, as interpreters, as, navigating the landscapes and helping troops, get around, talk to people, get information, and so on. They served with U.S. units during the war, and we have the 36 Korean graves just here. These are all Ptsds who were killed in action. Those graves, my understanding, they were created as a kind of symbolic presence or a representation of the ROK at the cemetery, so that they would have their troops resting alongside UN troops. Most of the Ptsds who were killed, thousands who died in the war, they're mostly buried in the national cemeteries. But just recently, in the past couple months, we got a request from a living Ptsd veteran of the war who served with a U.S. unit during the war who wanted to be buried here, and there was no precedent for that. So that was just discussed at our meeting in October of the commission, and they decided to permit it. Although I should add, I want to say this right. They approved it on an exceptional basis until we can actually draw up guidelines. Because the concern is that there are many thousands of them still living, and we just want to be sure that we have enough space, for everybody. Because we also, want to have space for all the sending states, veterans, and so that was the concern. So they just want to do a little more background. And study.
We're in the middle of the city now. You can't expand this any further, can you?
This place isn't getting any bigger. I can tell you that. It's no room for us to grow. So that was the concern. So they wanted to fulfill this gentleman's request, and he passed away very soon after that decision was given. He just passed away in the past week or so. So it was a nice thing that they were able to do that for him. Okay. So our homework for the coming year is going to be to do an analysis of our space and try to find out the best estimates on how many of these guys are still living and how many of them might want to be buried here, and then come up with some kind of guideline if we get requests like that in the future.
So should we head down the hill? So we're going to leave behind the flags and of all the nations here and walk down this hill slowly here.
I'll take you through the center here. Okay. Because this is a podcast, we get the VIP tour where you can walk on the grass. It's okay.
Yes, I should mention that this is a special event here. Special access we've been granted today. So
not just anyone can walk on the grass.
Yes, so. Though I do recommend it for people interested anyway, even if you don't get to walk along the grass and do the tour that we're doing. It is a very nice, peaceful place. It's very interesting as well because of the history. But it's something that I've come back to by myself since my first tour here. So I would recommend it, even if you don't get to do this thorough tour.
No, I agree. It's even if you have no interest in history or very little, it's just a very pleasant place to walk around, enjoy the greenery, We're passing by right now one of my favorite trees. This is a Crepe Myrtle, and we have several of these. These are actually common in the U.S., and that's a turtle dove there in the tree. I was just about to mention the doves like these trees because for shelter, and they sort of feed under them. That's usually where I find them.
Yeah.
So lots of birds, lots of trees. We still have roses this time of year, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
Yeah, it's been a balmy fall. Wow, there's a lot of them. Gosh, yeah, more than... We cut them back. The first bloom is, at the normal time, like early summer, I guess June. We'll take this path.
Okay.
And then they cut them back, I guess, around late August, and they get a second bloom, and they try to time it for the fall events, the 11th of November.
Yep.
And as you can see, they're right on target. But I have to say there's a lot more of them this year than I recall. It's been a bit warm, I guess.
I should ask you, seeing that 11th of November is just around the corner, what does happen here? What are the events for such an important date?
We have an event here called Turn Toward Busan, which was the brainchild of a Canadian veteran of the Korean War. And the idea was to use that date, which, as you know, is commemorated in several European nations. In the U.S., it's commemorated as, I believe it's Veterans Day, Remembrance Day in England and many European countries. So he used that date, and the 11th hour at 11 a.m., we have a big commemoration here. It's hosted by the Korean Ministry for Patriots and Veterans Affairs. All of our sending state ambassadors come, the military defense attachés. Normally they would bring veterans over as well. This year we'll see. We're not sure how the travel restrictions are going to work out.
Yeah.
But that's the idea. The idea is, the reason they call it Turn Toward Busan, I think, because the idea was to, at that moment, at that hour, on that day, to have people around the world sort of turn toward Busan and take a moment to, thank the veterans for their sacrifice and their service during the war.
Do you get a lot of international visitors, veterans and veterans' families coming here?
Well, yeah, we used to. I mean, this being the year of, COVID, everything's been sort of turned upside down. But normally we would, yeah. We have a few big events. Some of them are sponsored by the Korean government, by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs, who I'll refer to as MPVA from now on because it's easier. They sponsor a couple of events, the Turn Toward Busan event. And then in the spring, we had an event called the Commonwealth Veterans Revisit Program, where they would bring veterans from the Commonwealth nations, usually in late April, for a commemoration, and they would visit. Many of them served with a lot of the guys who were buried here, and it's a very moving trip. The numbers had been sort of dwindling year by year. As the veterans get older, I think the average age of a Korean War veteran would be around 90, give or take a year or two. So it gets harder for them to travel. But this year, unfortunately, they weren't able to do it. April, as you know, was pretty much peak COVID here. But last year, I think we got about 50 veterans, and family members, and it's really one of the highlights. It's great for a lot of those guys. It's their first time back in Korea since the war. Yeah. Very moving experience. As I mentioned, they visit the graves of their comrades, guys they knew, they served with, tell the stories. One of the really great things about being here for me is very often when they're here, this place brings out these stories in them that they haven't told anyone. Yeah. They just because it's not because I'm special, but because it's hard to talk about. I guess when you're back in wherever you're from, you're back in your hometown. You have no one really there's no one really. No impetus to get it going. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. And, so when they come here, there's a connection. They see the graves, the stories just naturally flow. They're with their other comrades who come back with them, and they talk and they talk and they talk. And just hear the most amazing, wonderful stories. That's one of the things that I cherish. And it's one of the things, unfortunately, that, we weren't able to do this year. So hopefully next year, we'll be able to do it. So,
all right.
I guess I could say a few words about where we are now. So we've walked down into the main grave area. You can see that we're in the British section here. The UK has the most graves here. There are 886. So that's 884 in this main area, plus 2 veterans buried below in recent years. One of them quite notable, too, I should mention. The name Bill Speakman might ring a bell. He rings a bell, yeah. He was a Victoria Cross recipient, one of only 4 to receive the Victoria Cross during the Korean War, and 3 of them are buried here. 2 were killed during the war. We're standing near their graves. Philip Curtis is over here.
Okay. Right.
And then Kenneth Muir. Yeah, I can show you those graves as well. The 4th gentleman, his name escapes me at the moment. Here's Curtis. And you can see on his stone they've marked, there's the VC, a likeness of the Victoria Cross. Curtis was killed in action, as was Kenneth Muir, who's buried just to our left over there. Bill Speakman survived the war. I don't know what you know of his story, but it's a pretty great story. He was his unit was defending a hill position, as they all were. I mean, every Korean War story was, well, so we were defending a hill position. And, they were in danger of being overrun. And he got, oh, sorry, let's pause here. Wasn't keeping very good track of the time there, but
yeah. So before we get back to Bill Speakman, we should explain just what we have seen, what happened there.
Yeah. So every day at 10, the UN flag is raised, and there's a small ritual attached. These small group of soldiers, these are the ROK 53rd Division Honor Guards who are stationed here. They marched out in formation, which unfortunately, they snuck by without me noticing it. It's kind of cool. You'll see them march out again in perfect synchronicity. Here they go. They're lining up. So they raise the flag every morning at 10. See, they'll sort of slowly kind of get where they need to be, and then they'll just sort of snap their heels and off they go. And they'll march right back to the gate, and then they'll be relieved.
Okay.
And then at 4 p.m., the flag comes down. So, yeah, anyone who would like to visit, it's good to time it to that. It's a small thing. Like I said, a small ritual. It takes a couple of minutes for them to march out, raise the flag, and go back. But it's actually, I've come to appreciate not just this ritual, but kind of ritual, the idea of ritual working here. It's kind of interesting. Like as a kid, one of the things I've kind of learned about myself working here. As a kid, when you're raised like in church, as I was raised, my mother did her best to raise me as a Catholic. And you sort of chafe at the ritual. You don't understand what they're for. And nothing against Catholic rituals per se, but just the idea of ritual. But working here really gave me an appreciation for ritual, for the idea of ritual, and really what it is. I mean, it's quite simple to me. It just forces you to kind of just stop whatever you're doing, just for a moment, and just stop and think about something else, and to focus on something else. So you look at the UN flag, you think about the war, you think about the guys who fought under that banner, and it takes a minute, but it's good to do that, and also because I think life, you get caught up in life, and you wouldn't otherwise think about these things. You'd be thinking about whatever you're paying your rent or what you're going to have for breakfast, or so it's good to sort of be obliged to take a minute to just sort of stop and reflect, and then carry on with whatever you were doing. So in our case, we were talking about Bill Speakman.
Okay, back to Bill Speakman. Yeah. So he's defending a hill, as so many people were. So that's
he was defending a hill, and he was, my understanding, he was part of the headquarters unit. So he wasn't like on the line himself. Don't quote me on that part, but the point of that is he heard that part of the unit was being overrun, one of the flanks. So he gathered up as many grenades as he could carry, and he rounded up a couple of his comrades, and they rushed to that part of the line, and they just started hurling grenades. It was like a grenade attack, and they held off this attack. And then when they would run out of grenades, they go back and get more. And then when they've exhausted the grenades, and here's where the story kind of drifts a bit into legend or myth. There are legends that he picked up rocks, he picked up beer bottles, he picked up whatever he could get his hands on. I think there was even a nickname. They called him like the beer bottle GI or beer bottle Bill or something. And that was referring to them just throwing bottles, rocks, whatever they could throw at these guys just to keep them off. So he was wounded in that as well. He survived his wounds. He went back to, I wish I could remember his hometown. He's from a smallish town in England. I can't remember quite where at the moment. But he actually went back to England, was, just hailed as a returning hero. He was just, you can imagine, this small town guy. He was a big guy, a giant of a man, about 6'5" or so, 6'6". And apparently he got tired of all the attention because he was, I understand, kind of a quiet guy. He liked his, his privacy. And so to kind of escape that, he actually re-enlisted, and he was back in Korea for another year. So he actually served a second tour in Korea, which was unusual.
It's very unusual when you read Korean war history. With a different unit?
With a different unit, yeah. He served initially, I think, with the Black Watch.
Okay.
And then he did his second tour with the King's Own Scottish Borderers. So he actually served with two different units for two years in Korea.
That is incredibly unusual. I've read a few books on the Korean War and these histories, and every soldier there just seems to want to get out. It's so cold, and in those early moments, we try throwing beer bottles and a grenade attack. In those early moments, look at the ages and the dates and many people that died. Those early moments, this wasn't the kind of majesty that we expect from the British Army or the American Army. They were horribly underprepared, weren't ready for the war, and really scrambling to bring up the right munitions and the right capabilities and the right mechanisms for the war. Exactly right. Yeah, they were, especially in the early part of the war, where they were really caught, without these supplies, without munitions. A lot of the veterans who were part of the push into North Korea in 50-51 that winter, they didn't have like proper winter gear. Every one of them talks about how cold they were. I mean, it's like the first thing they say, when I ask them, what do you remember? They're like, I've never been that cold before or since. I mean, it's the coldest I've been in my life. So yeah, there was a lot of that. Curtis, he's been well written about. He was slightly older, to say. He was age 24. He was a lieutenant. And he was killed attacking an enemy machine gun. They were attacking kind of a dug-in machine gun position that was kind of commanded a line of fire, field of fire over his company. Mm. So he led an attack to try to destroy this gun, and he physically charged it. He was running at it, and he was shot. He was encouraged by his men to stop the attack and go back, but apparently he refused. He kept going. And he managed to get a grenade into this machine gun position and destroy it just as he was killed simultaneously in the attack. So he was awarded the Victoria Cross for that action. He's buried here, and one of his other comrade, Kenneth Muir, Major, is buried just there. He died in a similar situation, like defending a hill against an overwhelmingly large force. Eventually overwhelmed, but managed to hold it long enough so they could evacuate wounded. And he was credited with saving the lives of many of the men in that company. And I must ask what you just said there. He says 24 and he's one of the older ones, one of the veterans here. And it's true. I mean, you look at the graves around us, these are all very, very young men here. Yeah, I couldn't tell you the average age, but my guess would be closer to 20 than 24 would have been old. Yeah. As you can see, he was an officer. The enlisted men, the privates, would have been younger. I mean, the youngest we have buried here is 17, an Australian soldier. Okay. And he's the youngest one that we can confirm. And the reason I say that is because many guys lied about their age in those days. They were younger than that. They wanted to sign up. In many cases, their big brothers had served in the Second World War, and they wanted to, do the same. So they would lie, or they would use their brother's, ID or something and sign up. There's a funny story in that connection. I met an American veteran here once, and he would have been, I think he was a sergeant, but he was not an officer, but he was like a squad leader or a platoon leader. And he said, just during our talk, he said, yeah, I was 20 years old during the war, and the guys in my unit called me Pop because I was the oldest. He said, 20 years old, the oldest, leading a platoon of soldiers. I mean, it's stuff like that just boggles my mind when I think about what I was doing at age 20. I was in college. Yeah. Trying to figure out how to scratch together $5 so I can go out and drink beer all night on a Friday. And this guy's leading 20 men, in combat. It just blows my mind. Yeah. And he was the oldest guy in his unit that they looked up to. He's 17, 18-year-olds that he commanded, Just incredible. There's a couple of graves just beyond us here. We're still in the British section here. And they say unnamed, it seems. It says soldier of the British Army,
Yes.
known unto God, and that's it. So I'm assuming there are a number of graves here in the cemetery that they know belong to a certain army, but they are unrecognizable.
There are a few, there just those 4 graves by the very end under those holly bushes there. You can see 4 graves just at the end. Those are unknown UN forces. So, yeah, as you said, we don't know who they belong to. They're known to be UN forces, but not known which nation. The British have the highest number of unknowns buried here, and you caught me on that one too. I'm not sure. It's in the dozens. It's several dozens of unknowns, and then there are a smattering of others here and there. Turks and French, I think, have one. Yeah. So there are quite a few. Yeah, it was a tricky job of recovery. There's a guy who comes here every year by the name of James Grundy. He's a British veteran of the Korean War. And his job during the war was actually recovery of remains that had been temporarily buried near battlefields. Okay. Locating them, exhuming them, and then transporting them here for proper burial at the cemetery. And he talked to me once. I've met him several times. He comes every year, and he loves to talk and tell stories. He's a great guy. But he told me a story once that it kind of made me appreciate like how you end up with so many unknowns. You'd have these actions out wherever. I mean, the peninsula, you'd have a few guys killed. The unit would bury them kind of in that location, mark it on a map, and then the unit would move on to their next, post. And then later, once they had the personnel, people like James and units like grave registration units, recovery teams, they would send them to those locations, try to find those remains, and then bring them back here. But in many cases, they were remains. They'd been in the ground for anywhere from weeks to months, severely decomposed, and made identification very hard. And these were not, forensic anthropologists or people who had that sort of training. These were 19-year-old kids. Yeah. In fact, James told me he was selected for that job because he had worked part-time at an undertaker somewhere in England. So they said, okay, you're going to be a great, recovery, unit. And like, yeah. Okay, so they sent him out with a map and a shovel and a truck with 5 guys, pretty remarkable. But he told me a story once where they found a site where they had I think 3 or 4 remains, and the way they had a protocol where to identify them, the dog tag and their papers that they carried, I think it was had related to their pay or some documents that they all would have carried, had to match. So if the document matched the dog tag, they could positively ID that guy. But he said this one particular set of graves that they exhumed, the 4 guys were there, and they all had the papers, they all had the dog tags, but they had been switched somehow. So, say dog tag A had paper B, and dog tag C had paper A, and so it was like this. So they knew they had the 4 guys, but because they couldn't say who was who, unfortunately, they had to be buried as unknowns. So we know that those remains were recovered, and then they have proper graves. We just can't say for certain who they are. He talked about the challenges of IDing, and as you can see, there are dozens here that probably the stories were similar. Like the dog tags were gone, or papers were mixed and matched or missing, and they couldn't say for sure who they were. So according to the protocol, they had to just say, okay, they're unknown.
How much of your job involves that kind of expatriation work? Because we do hear sometimes in the media remains come in discovered or it's been held in North Korea and we have it. But it's also around South Korea occasionally we find remains. I mean, there's still mountains that I've hiked on here that have landmine signs saying don't go up here. So how often is your job involved in the difficult job of repatriating remains either back or forth between different countries?
Well, it's actually a very well-timed question because we're actually standing. You'll notice here in this row of graves, there's a plot sort of missing here. There would have been a grave. There was actually a grave here. And in fact, it was one of the very first things that I worked on when I started here, 2017. This was the grave of what was then believed to be an unidentified British soldier, and these were remains that were repatriated from North Korea that the North Koreans had found and had been holding for who knows how long, and were repatriated, I believe, in the early 90s. Someone exercising. I thought they were trying to get my attention.
We should mention just that around us, it is such a nice, peaceful place that people use the rim of the cemetery as an improv workout area. A lot of older men and women seem to be using this as an exercise routine.
Yeah, they're not. I should mention they're not supposed to. Technically, you're not supposed to. How can I say? Conspicuously exercise. If you just want to take a walk, no one's going to stop you. But so in the early '90s, North Korea repatriated 208 boxes of remains, as you recall. Similarly happened a few years ago. Where they were 55, I believe. And it was a similar situation where they were really mixed up, and the North Koreans presented each box as one set, but that turned out not to be the case. There were many individuals mixed together, some cases animal bones and all sorts of things they had to sort out. So this soldier was initially thought to be British because he came accompanied by a dog tag, the name of Edmonds, a British soldier named Edmonds. So they, as they all do, they go to the lab. I believe they would have been sent to the DPAA lab in Hawaii, and DPAA is the U.S. Department of Defense POW MIA accounting agency, the forensic anthropologists and archaeologists who ID remains. They ruled out that particular soldier based on an analysis of his bones. His height would have been vastly different from that soldier, so they thought still he may have been British. The reasoning, I think, was he was probably recovered near a British unit. Okay. So if it wasn't him, it was probably one of his comrades in the same unit. So they buried him as an unknown British soldier in 1998 here, the spot where we're standing. In 2017, about the time I started, they had been contacted by DPAA again, saying that they knew who these guys were, and it was two guys, Americans, whose remains had been commingled, and they requested to disinter them, confirm their analysis, and then repatriate them to the U.S. So that was one of the very first things I worked on, which was first listening to their presentation. The forensic team came from Hawaii to Busan to present their findings and their case for why they thought they were who they said they were. And then the next step was for me to kind of coordinate with the Casualty Assistance Office, the head mortician up at the USFK and then in Yongsan, to actually, disinter them and get them, sent off to Hawaii again. So it was funny because I was brand new here. I'd been working here for a couple of months, I think. Yeah. And I'm asking my colleagues, so how do disinterments work around here? And nobody had ever done one before. Probably the last disinterment before that was, I don't know, in the 1950s. Yeah. So nobody had ever done one, so I kind of had to figure it out. And but we got them home, and they were confirmed. They did turn out to be two Americans, and then they were later reburied in the United States with their families present, full military honors and all that. So it was a really nice thing to be able to, assist with in a small way. And that was the first. We actually had a couple since then, 2 New Zealand soldiers, and that was a different case. These were guys who we knew who they were, but they had died after the cutoff date that the New Zealand government had set. They had said anyone who died, I think, after January 1955 was eligible for repatriation. But I think in practice it didn't often happen just because it was logistically difficult. So 2 of our New Zealand graves here fell into that category. They were buried in 56, 57, I think. So they were repatriated by the government of New Zealand a couple of years ago. That was another one I worked on. And we're actually currently working on another one. The Korean government right now is planning to disinter 8 of the graves I showed you earlier, those Korean graves. 5 of them are unknowns. And then 3 of them, there's some discrepancy in their burial reports. So they just want to confirm their IDs. There's some, I guess, question they just want to settle to just confirm them. So they're going to do 8 disinterments. Sometime next year, it looks like they're going to present their case in the spring, and then we'll see where to go from there. So thankfully now I've done this kind of thing before. I'll be able to help.
Yes,
be able to be a bit more helpful than I was, I think, in 2017.
So we're just walking across now into the center. So we've come about a little more than halfway down the cemetery now, and we're right in the middle. So British graves behind us to the left, and off to the right, I can see Turkish flags, Canadian flags. So what are we standing at right now here?
This is one of the oldest monuments that was erected at the cemetery. It's the Commonwealth Memorial Commonwealth Monument, and it lists all of the missing in action from all of the Commonwealth nations. You see, which then would have included South Africa as well. So it lists them by unit. You have Royal Navy, it was very Royal Marines, and then it goes around the back. Pretty much every unit, that served, they lost someone. The Royal New Zealand Navy. Yes. There were a couple still, I think, MIA from New Zealand, and then some of the regiments were very, very storied regiments. The Gloucester Regiment, you probably have heard of.
Yes, a lot.
The glorious Gloucesters.
This is one of those infamous tales of the war. Whole books written about Gloucester Hill, and but yeah, it's amazing to see. Yeah, amazing to see the names and the company in person here.
Yeah, and there's actually a very good book written by a Seoul-based expat, Andy Salmon, who you may know. Yes, Andy's written a very good book about them called To the Last Round, which I highly recommend. I'm not paid to say that. I gladly recommend it. But as you can see, the Gloucesters lost a lot of guys. They were, that unit that was basically cut off, and they weren't able to withdraw. So they really just fought, to the last round. So most of them were either killed or captured. A few of them did manage to slip through. Not many. I forget how many, but a handful. But many, as you can see, were killed. Probably more than any other unit. The Royal Ulster Rifles lost quite a lot of guys as well. But yeah, they've been sort of much written about, and for good reason. It's a really unique circumstance, when a unit really is just forced into that sort of situation where there's no escape, and you just decide, all right, well, we're gonna.
And it's another one of those moments when they're stuck on a hill basically, and if there's no reinforcements behind you, and if you've been encircled, and this was a common thread running all across those early days of the Korean War. Yeah,
right. Yeah, they were trying to withdraw from the area, and some of the other nearby units had managed to withdraw, but they forget the logistics of it. Andy's book will explain it much better than I am, but they were basically cut off. There was no way out, and they decided they were just going to go down fighting. Yeah, and that's what they did. It's a very, very storied regiment, decorated regiment. Goes down in the lore of the British military. For good reason. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I can take you. Why don't we wander sort of through this path? These I learned this is not actually that exciting, but these holly bushes.
Yep.
They are kind of cool, and they sort of look like helmets, which I don't think was intentional. They just sort of. I don't know, they just sort of trimmed them this way.
Yeah, very much so, actually.
These were one of the first things planted here, I discovered, when they started to beautify the cemetery in the 70s.
Okay.
And I found out these holly bushes are just about as old as I am. I'm 49. They were planted around the same time. 74, so they're actually my brother's age. But there's these cool old bushes, yeah. You won't quite see this much holly anywhere. But they do kind of now look like helmets, the shape they've taken on.
Slight slope in the middle as well, yeah.
They're pretty cool. I just mentioned that. That's a little bit of trivia, a little bit horticultural trivia. They actually hired a British horticulturist to come here in the 70s. One sort of historical tidbit I can mention, the cemetery, as I said, was created by the UN Command, and it was run by the UN Command as a military cemetery. When the war ended, in 59, the Korean government formally transferred the land and control of the cemetery to the United Nations General Assembly. And they ran it through a committee called UNKIRK, which was the UN Committee for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea. So they had an office in Seoul. They had a guy here who they paid to run it, and he would contract labor to kind of just cut the grass. And very basic. It was still like a military cemetery with the white crosses. And very simple. But then in the 70s, in 74, the UN handed it off to the commission that runs it today, and those are the 11 countries who have their people here. And around that time, they decided they really wanted to beautify this place. So one of the first things they did is they hired a British horticulturalist. He flew him over to kind of study the grounds, make his recommendations, and sort of draw up sort of the first plan for beautifying the cemetery. So they started digging drainage. This was all sort of swampy, marshy land that would have been pretty much covered in water from here on down. So one of the first things they did was drain it and then direct it into a pond there. They created a pond.
Okay.
And then the other end, there's a little sort of marsh still where I can show you with like reeds and small animals of all kinds. And then, planting trees. We have trees now. None of these trees were here then. These have all been planted since then. But yeah, the holly bushes, that's kind of what got me thinking about it. That was one of the first things they planted to sort of mark the limit of what was then the actual graveyard. So they're about 50 years old, those bushes.
I mean, when I first saw it, the first thing I thought was that same thing in my mind about just the grounds. They're immaculate, they're kept. I mean, if people can hear a slightly bit in the background, it's people working on them constantly at the moment as well. So yeah, it's an amazing picture that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can hear the noise. There's a lot of grass to cut. Trees, our trees are very well managed. We lose some in the storm, so they're. You can see these have been propped up. We got the grass blowers going. These guys over here, they're setting up a stage for that concert I mentioned on the 10th of November.
Okay.
We're having, I forget the exact title of it. I think it's called the Peace Concert. But it's going to be a program of music related to the theme of peace, which will be the first time there's ever been a concert here. So it'll be a lot of it by invitation, like I believe the Ministers of Veterans Affairs of Korea will be here, as well as some foreign Veterans Affairs ministers, defense attachés, ambassadors, and then the program of music is related to the theme of peace and this sort of thing. So yeah, it'll be interesting. They're going to have it in the evening. So it'll be dark. I think around 7 p.m. it starts. So they're setting up the stage here, and I think it's going to face this way. I think they wanted it to be near the monument, but in a space large enough where they could distance people, for COVID precautions.
So we should explain what the monument is. So we're looking across now. It's the wall of remembrance I can see written there. And it's the names, I believe, of all the fallen soldiers?
Sure.
All the people that fought.
Yeah, sure. Why don't we
let's wander across in there.
Yeah, it's a wall of black marble, similar to the one, those of your listeners who are familiar with the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. Mm-hmm. Same idea. It's black marble with names engraved, and it lists the 40,896 names of all the UN forces who died in the Korean War. It's sort of semicircular, surrounding a circular fountain or pool, I should say, with 22 fountains, and the number 22 again is symbolic of the 22 sending states. That number crops up a lot, number 22, and also the number 11, which is the number of nations on our commission, our governing commission. But little bit of trivia there. Germany was just added was officially recognized as a sending state just a couple of years ago, and that's a long story I won't get into. But basically, they had sent a hospital that arrived after the armistice. So for a long time, they weren't considered a sending state because they weren't actually here during what's considered the war period. But they did operate a hospital for several years. So around that time, the Ministry of Defense sent word all around Korea to all places like ours and museums and things, asking to update our facilities to reflect the fact that there were now 22 sending states. So that, for the most part, it was easy. Like we had to add a flagpole here, a flagpole there. That's relatively easy. But the trickiest bit was trying to find a place to stick a 20-second fountain in this pool here, and it would amaze you the amount of time and we spent discussing this and working on it. It won't interest your listeners, but I guess I mentioned it to show the kind of the care they take to really ensure that everyone's contribution is recognized and honored. And so we did actually find a place to put a 20-second fountain just next to that block there. That didn't require us to pull them all out and respace them and everything, which would have been a nightmare. But yeah, why don't I take you in?
All right, let's walk around the back. So the left side here, and we'll walk up and see some of the names and some of the countries here.
It was funded by the Korean government in 2006. This wouldn't be the type of thing that our budget would allow us to do, but the Korean government, and from the national level to the local level, they've been great partners over the years and doing things like this, like building this monument. The beautification of the cemetery, which I mentioned earlier, that costs a lot of money. and lots of improvements around the cemetery. I can talk more about a bit later. But I just mentioned that, yeah, they built, or they provided the funding for this monument, to honor all of the UN forces. Anyone who's been to the War Memorial in Seoul, where there's the UN forces plus the Korean forces, that wall is several times larger.
Yeah.
I forget the exact number, but it's well over 200,000. I forget the exact figure. This one, as I said, just under 41,000. It's just the UN forces, beginning alphabetically with Australia and then continuing down.
And you'd be shocked by some of the countries if you weren't familiar with the war, but had to guess the country as the 22. In front of me, I'm looking at Colombia and Ethiopia, and Luxembourg has 2 deaths over there as well. It's a real. I mean, this is the early days of the UN, of course. So I suppose the conglomeration of nations is a little bit hodgepodge in some ways.
It is, yeah. And you said it was a bit of a quick history lesson for me, too. A lot of the names surprised me the first time. I wouldn't have guessed Ethiopia if it had popped up at a pub quiz or something. Yeah. Some of them, of course, we know. Greece. Some of them, the numbers are surprising, like Turkey. Proportionally, probably the highest number. Don't quote me on that, but to give you just some sense of perspective, the United States sent the highest number of troops, somewhere around 1.6 million over the 3 years. Lost about 37,000, so it's a fraction of 1%. Turkey, by contrast, sent, I believe, a total of about 16,000, give or take, a couple of thousand or two, and lost over 1,000 of those troops. So doing some quick, back of the envelope math, it's closer to 7%, 8% of their forces were killed in action, so a much, much higher proportion. And you can see the numbers here. They take up more than 3 full panels of a force, the size, smaller, I believe, than was sent by the UK. Larger, though, again, but then, or about the same size as the force sent by Canada, Australia, and so on. But lost a huge number of guys.
And it has had an impact. I speak to Turkish people, and I've read a lot about it as well. And there's a deep, lasting friendship, a surprising one between Korea and Turkey that you'll bump into again and again and again. And it comes back to the war and this huge sacrifice that Turks made.
Yeah, I see the same thing when they come here. Like, we get visitors from Turkey. Again, this year being sort of unusual, but we get visitors. Any Turk who has any sort of business anywhere in Korea kind of makes a side trip to come here. It doesn't matter what they're doing. They could be in Seoul for a seminar. They come down here by train. They visit here and go back. It's almost like strikes me as almost like a pilgrimage for them. As you said, it's like the war being the thing that kind of not only cemented their relationship with Korea, but as one Turkish defense attaché explained to me, it was kind of Turkey's first sort of steps into the community of nations, into NATO, and apparently I'm not quite clear on the history of all that, but according to him, it was very instrumental in their sort of entry into NATO, and that sense that Turkey belonged to NATO and that community of nations. And the Korean War was a big step in that direction, and it's something they're all very proud of. And they come here. It occurs to me now, I should have shown you. They're up in the Turkish section in the Symbolic Area. Yeah. They installed a glass case on the ground. I'll show you that later. Okay. But it's a case with a glass covering that can be removed, and it's full of things that visiting Turks have brought here, because so often they were coming here and leaving things like not just like flowers and the sort of typical things, but like flags and soil from Turkey, all sorts of stuff. And just to protect it and to keep it sort of longer, we actually had a case installed. So I'm really sorry I didn't point it out while we were up there.
We'll wander back on the way up.
I'll make sure I show that to you next time, because it's really remarkable, and it shows again, and that's extraordinary. There is no other case like that. There was no reason for any of the other nations, not to say they don't honor their dead, but for the Turks, like you said, it is a very special. The Korean War was a very special moment in their history, and this is a very special place for them to visit.
And now we've walked into the American section, and it is huge. It's so large, in fact, that it's separated not just by America as a country, but by state as well, as Arizona, Alaska, and it runs through the different states. And it looks like almost half the wall is made up of American names.
It's close. Yeah, well, it's from this side. It's true. It looks like half. You'll see on the back side. It's
Okay.
it's quite a bit larger. But yeah, the one thing I like to point out, especially to American visitors, just to give a sense of the scale of the involvement. U.S. Is last alphabetically, and as you mentioned, they're broken down further by state to make it easier to search for visitors. But it continues. The end of what we're looking at here on the inner sort of circle. That's just like Indiana. That's just the letter I.
Yeah.
And then it continues around the back. Yeah. And I'll show you. I can show you that.
Okay,
but to me, it has a lot more impact than reading a number in a book or on a website.
Yeah.
You see the number. About 37,000 Americans died of the 41,000 total. About roughly 90%. But reading a number and actually seeing what that means when you actually write the names out, it's really moving. It's really striking, and it really grabs you in a way. I want to pause here. So I mentioned, like, when you're standing on the inside, it looks like about half of them are American, and you think it sort of ends there. But then you turn this corner, and what we're looking at now, so the back side of the curve is also engraved with names. And then behind the curve, there's a separate wall of black marble, also engraved with names, and all American. And one of the things I like to do is sort of, when I guide people through here, I'll sort of position myself slightly ahead of them here, because I like to see their reaction when they turn the corner here, and they see like, oh wow, like I had no idea, like
the full scale suddenly hits you, right?
Yeah. So we're looking now. The end of the curved part on the back here is New York, my home state, which continues there, and then it goes across this separate wall back to I believe it's Wyoming, to the last. But as I said, every state is represented. The territories, the Commonwealths, the Virgin Islands you see there, Guam. There's a panel of unknowns too, and people ask me how that came to be, and the short answer is I don't know. I can offer
so unknown location. The names are all there, but it's an unknown tablet above it. So I'm assuming they don't know which state they're from, or when they did sign up, they perhaps gave not misleading, but information that didn't match up in some way.
Exactly right. Yeah. So the names are known. They're known to have died. They have known graves. It's just when they were assembling this wall, it wasn't known. They couldn't say definitively what state they were from for any number of reasons.
So we're back away from the fountains and the noise, and of course the memorial wall. We're walking down. This is towards the bottom of the memorial park now.
Yes. So we are now in what we refer to as the green area. Very imaginatively named. It's just a big, open space. As I said, they allotted a lot of land in those days. They weren't sure how much would actually be needed. So that now, it's mostly, as you can see, open space, trees. This monument, called the UN Forces Monument, this was actually one of the first built by the Korean government. It was actually dedicated by President Park Chung-hee, I believe in 1978, not long before he died. And there's kind of an interesting story. So you can see as we get close to it, just above, just walk a little closer so I can read it more easily.
So it's a really large white stone wall that we're looking at as we walk down towards the bottom. Two large doves on either side.
Right. And then you can see in Hangul, it says UN-gun Wiryang Tap, so UN Forces Monument. And the actual writing of those letters was done, in pen by President Park.
Oh, okay.
And they, made them into metal sort of fixtures that they could stick onto the wall. It was a couple of years ago. I remember we got a complaint from someone because we mentioned that fact because it's just a historical fact. Like the president happened to write the lettering that was used for the monument. He dedicated it. Fair enough. But someone complained that we sort of pointed that fact out. We have a little plaque somewhere that just says, the letters were handwritten by President Park Chung-hee. And of course, somebody's going to say something like,
so much of Korean history is fraught in either direction, right?
So as you know, he was a controversial figure, and someone got upset that we pointed out that he actually wrote the letters. So we're officially apolitical. We welcome people of all nations, all political stripes. We're all welcome here, and we want them all to be comfortable here. And we just pointed out as a historical fact that he just happened to write those letters.
It's a tricky one as an apolitical organization, because even taking it down is a political act, then, isn't it?
It would be, yeah. That's a good point. It's just, you would think just the writing of letters and dedicating a monument to the UN forces is a pretty politically, well, I was going to say politically neutral. I'm sure there were people who weren't, maybe thought the UN shouldn't have got involved. Say maybe that itself is a political question. But the way we see it is, the fact is the UN forces did intervene in Korea. They did so for the stated purpose of deterring aggression, defending the sovereignty of Korea. And, we honor the people who actually volunteered and who actually did that, who actually came and fought and died. So we believe, and my colleagues and I, and a lot of people, I'm sure, I know, probably most people think, you can honor that regardless of what you think about the politics of the war. You honor the soldiers who, soldiers don't make the policy and don't decide the politics. They just, do what they see as their duty, and they do it honorably, and we honor that service. So, but yeah, you can't please everyone, but we try.
Yes.
We try. So I mentioned earlier, about 5 years ago, a French and British veteran of the war asked to be buried here when they died, and one of them has since passed away. He's buried here. He was the first veteran to be buried in this new area, which you see just ahead of us to the right.
So this is really quite separate from the other graves. I missed them. So we just walked past them, 3 or 4 minutes ago, and I completely missed them because they are really quite separate from the main body of the graves further up the cemetery.
Yeah, it's easy to miss. It's actually, as I mentioned, fairly new and still evolving. Like it's was started, as I said, 5 years ago. You see, it's 11 graves now. We've just started a second row, so the last burial forced us to think about how that area is going to grow and expand. And they've started planting now bushes, rose bushes. I can take you in there and show you. Sure. So the first gentleman, as I said, he's a French gentleman. This is before I started here, Mr. Bernard. He was buried here in 2015. And then over the years, it's been about 2 a year on average. And there, as you can see, we don't separate them as we did there by nationality. So you have the UK next to him. We have a few from the Netherlands, US, France, Canada. I believe that covers it. We got a letter a few years ago from a Belgian veteran who's living in Japan with his Japanese wife. He's requested to be buried here. He and I correspond regularly. I told him, you're approved, but there's no rush.
No rush.
Take your time. So we have a funny correspondence going back and forth. But now when we have burials, they happen here. There's Bill Speakman, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah. Big Bill. I had the pleasure of meeting his family, his sons and daughter. They were here for his burial. Your ambassador came down, and it was quite a big thing. Yeah, it was really special. Mr. McBride, he was the first Canadian to be buried in this section. Dressler, he's one of now 3 Americans, and the reason we're just waiting on his information from his family to come. One of the things we like to print, apart from the obvious things like name, date of birth, date of death, we want to put the name of the unit with which they served and their period of service in Korea, and we're just still waiting on that information. Those records are sometimes a little slow to produce, so but yeah, we'll add that bit later.
Okay.
The first one I worked on was this gentleman, Mr. Alderweireld. When I started here, this was the first burial that I worked on. And it was really moving. I mean, they all are. And one of the things that particularly struck me, the ambassador at that time of the Netherlands, Lodi Embrechts, and he came and he gave a really moving speech. And he actually got to know a lot of these guys. They have a pretty cohesive veterans organization in the Netherlands, and they keep close touch, and he apparently had met them. And I guess when the first one, Wessels, had died, a lot of his comrades in the veterans organization had come over for that burial, and I think that was probably when Ambassador Embrechts had met them. Anyway, Ambassador Embrechts got to know Alderweireld, and so when he died, he told the story at his burial, and he mentioned that when he came for the burial of his comrade, Wessels, he was so moved by the reception from the Korean people. Like as I said, they treat them like returning heroes. So they really just go all out to make these guys feel special and thank them and honor them. And he said he was so moved by that he said to him at the time, he said, he decided right then, he said, I want to be buried in the country where my sacrifice meant something. And I swear I choke up now even thinking about it. It was so moving because it sort of encapsulates a lot of his story back in the Netherlands where, like a lot of guys who served, they would go back and it was like the war never happened. Like people,
famous
hey,
phrase.
so you're back. Where you been? Korea? Oh, yeah, great.
Yeah.
And that was it. That was the end of it.
Famous phrase. We have the forgotten war and things like this.
Right.
And in our countries, so many countries in the world, it seems to have slipped past to most people's general history.
Right. Yeah. They felt like it was just forgotten, like it meant nothing. And he was so moved by that. He said, when I came to Korea and I could see it meant something, like these people really appreciated it and they really thanked me for it. And it moved him so much that he decided then to be buried here when he passed away. And there he is.
It also shows you how such an important moment, such conflict can be in people's lives because, his conflict, his service meant so much more in Korea. But his life was so much longer than the conflict itself. But it still was such a poignant moment in his life that it drags him back to the idea that he wants to be buried in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. For someone like me, who's never served in the military, never served in a war, it's something I can never fully appreciate. But when you hear the stories and like you said, how so many things go on, the fact like a lot of them can't talk about it. They're not encouraged to talk about it. There's nothing that sort of spurs those stories or memories. And a lot of them suffered what we now recognize as PTSD, which in those days, didn't exist. They call it shell shock, or they would just say, hey, come on, it's over. Just get on with it. Yeah. But a lot of these guys really suffered. You hear stories, he was apparently an alcoholic, struggled throughout his life to keep his relationships, his jobs, and struggled with alcoholism. And for a lot of them, that was the case. They drank. Their relationships suffered. They really suffered, a lot of them. And there wasn't anything like the support they get now, where we recognize PTSD as a proper malady, and it's treated as a health issue, as a medical problem. But in those days, it was just a pat on the back and come on,
get on with it.
Get on with it. But it's really moving. We have a couple on the calendar too. One gentleman I mentioned recently passed away, an American veteran who was living up near, I think in Yongsan at a nursing home, just passed away just a few days ago. And then the Katusa gentleman who I mentioned, he also died recently. So we'll have a couple more burials coming up. Anyone, by the way, is welcome to attend those if you're ever curious. We generally don't kind of broadcast them, but they're not secret either. We just assume that families are the only people who would really be interested. But if anyone is, at all interested in seeing one of these burials and paying respects, please, get in touch, and you'd be very welcome to attend. Yeah. It is, like you were saying before, it's just, you can see a lot of people, in fact, most people probably come here just to kind of take a walk in a nice environment. But this tree especially, it draws a crowd. It's not much to look at now. This one on stilts here.
Okay, so we're looking at this. It looks like a beaten down tree, and it's been held up with bamboo supports. Of course, the leaves have fallen off. This is mid-fall, I suppose, when we're recording this.
Yeah, this poor tree has been through the ringer. It's not much to look at now, as you said. It's just sort of bare, and it's being held up by stilts. This is the first tree to bloom every year. It's a red plum tree. Okay. In Korean, Hongmehwa. And it's quite stunning. It's got these beautiful, I'm terrible at describing colors, but they're almost like a darkish pink bordering on crimson color. Really beautiful. And it bloomed last year like the day after Christmas. It blooms really early. Yeah. So because it's the first one to bloom, and there's another one just over there, just behind this holly bush. Yeah. It draws a crowd of people who are, looking forward to spring, and they want to see flowers. And, Koreans love their flowers, and they love nature. So it draws a crowd, and every year people would sort of wander over to it and take their selfies. And so we try to keep people off the grass as best we can, just to keep the grass protected. But we kind of gave up with this tree just because so many people were sort of flocking to
And
it.
you can actually see the ground around the bottom of the tree does look a little bit more worn and trodden in that grass there.
Well trodden grass over there. So what we started doing was we kind of rope it off. When it starts to bloom, we create like a photo line. We rope it off, and we welcome people to come in and take their pictures, but sort of stay in that sort of general area. But it's a beautiful tree, and so the reason it's on stilts, it got knocked over in that last storm just it was a few weeks ago. Very, very recently, and just totally uprooted, toppled over. So I think if it had been literally any other tree, they would have just said, oh well, kind of cart it off, chop it up. But because it was that tree, I mean, the local newspapers come to photograph it when it blooms. It's it's become a sort of a celebrity. So they really did their best to save it. So we'll see.
Hopefully it hangs in there, huh?
Hopefully it hangs in there, yeah. Blooms again this year. So I'll be posting on Facebook if it blooms. That'll be big news. Yeah,
absolutely.
But yeah, we get a lot of nature lovers. I was saying, I mean, people just come. I get the impression they just come to enjoy the quiet and the scenery and the sound of birds and the smell of cut grass and the peaceful.
I mean, that was my first impression when I first saw it. I despite all the solemn nature of the place, I thought it's so peaceful, so nice. It's the kind of place you want to come back to by yourself and just sit down,
Yeah, and people are welcome to do that. We of course want to promote awareness of the cemetery and the history and all that, but people are very welcome to just come and enjoy the scenery as well. Yeah, I take advantage of that too.
What is the memorial across to the right? Oh, I can see from a distance. This is a Australian War Memorial.
The Australian Memorial. There are a couple of stories here, too, I may have mentioned when you were here last, but I'll repeat for your listeners. This was the original monument, was this plaque mounted on like a brick base. And a few years ago, when was this built? 98, 2000? Oh, no, that would have been the old one, sorry. The new one, I have to check the date, but fairly recent. It got this sort of upgrade. They built this structure to sort of shield it from the front. There's this honoring all of the Australian forces, and then this site, as well as the others, like there's a monument to the U.S., Canada, there's UK, the lion.
Oh, large lion up there, yes.
The black sort of square one is the French memorial, and then there are several to Turkey. Turkey has like 3.
And each individual country installs their own, or
yes, right. Yeah. So those are all financed by their respective governments, and they're all welcome to do it. In fact, we encourage it. We like that they do that. New Zealand has a beautiful one up top, and then there are several smaller ones up in the upper area. Greece, Thailand, Colombia, Norway have smaller monuments, but these also serve as the sites. Like when we get a visiting delegation from those countries, like they'll very often have a ceremony here. They'll lay a wreath of flowers and poppies and so on, visit the graves. So it's good. It gives them kind of like a locus of their commemoration.
We're about midway again in the cemetery, and we're just walking back up the hill to where we began. So again, up the grass here, through the main section of the graves. Amazing still that the roses are still in bloom.
I know. It's really unusual. Normally we'd have a few, but there's sort of these scrawny, fall roses that have managed to just poke out, but these are pretty lush.
Is it, you mentioned briefly before, but I don't see a lot of it around. Is it encouraged families and friends or anyone interested to come and leave things on the graves? Because all the graves here, they're all the same structure, of course, one to the next. Mm-hmm. But of course, apart from the rose bush to the side of them, they don't seem to be what you might expect in a graveyard in other countries where you see arrangements of flowers and wreaths, but they all seem quite clean.
Right. Well, I think I mean, people are welcome to do that. I think the reason you don't see more of them is just because the families are so seldom visit. It's just they're so far away. But when people do come, they tend to come in large groups, like they're government sponsored, or but we do get individual families will come over. These days, it's more like grandkids or grandnephews and nieces, and they'll come and they'll lay some flowers on the grave. Expatriations, in all the cases I worked on, they were paid for by the respective nations. So in the case of the U.S., that was, they sent the USFK personnel up here. So that was all. And then they'll transport, they transport to Hawaii using, military transportation.
Mm-hmm.
New Zealand was the same. That was funded by the New Zealand government. They sent a team here, financed that project, and they actually traveled all around. They'd been to, I think, Malaysia and Papua New Guinea and some pretty far-flung places before they came here. The current one by Korea, is going to be funded by what's called MACRI. That's the, what's that acronym? The MIA. I forget what the acronym exactly stands for at the moment, but it's basically the agency responsible for identifying war remains, the forensic labs and associated teams. So they'll be doing those. They'll be financing that. So it really depends. Although I think Korea and the U.S., they do have, just because I think they have the best developed facilities for that and infrastructure for that, they do offer assistance. Like, so for example, if a Thai soldier or a British soldier or whatever remains they get, they ID and because I guess that's too, if you get remains, that are unidentified, in principle, you don't know who they are. So if it turns out to be a Thai, they don't go, oh, well, we wasted our time on that one. Of course they assist.
And that's an important point, because you imagine a lot of countries haven't spent much time with problems of repatriation and identifying remains. As you mentioned before, the difficulties in discovering, from bone fragments of who a soldier may or may not have been. It must be an incredibly challenging thing to do. And as you said, the main center seems to be based in Hawaii these days.
Right. Yeah. The DPAA, who I mentioned earlier, they have their lab there. And then my understanding is they cooperate with other labs who do other aspects of the work. Like, but they coordinate all of that work. And they do, I think, the bulk of the forensic analysis there. They have teams. This was another thing that kind of blew me away, is like they have dedicated teams to just the Korean War, just the Vietnam War, Second World War. Like, they're each separate teams, and these are forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, odontologists whose full-time, like Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job is identifying war remains. And the resources and the money involved in that, obviously, it's not something that every country can afford to do. So I know that they cooperate and they assist with other countries identifying the remains of soldiers from other countries. And I believe Korea is doing that too. In fact, they just offered one of the things that we just sort of announced on their behalf at our last meeting was that MACRI and the Korean government is willing to assist if any of the member states, sending states, wish to have help in identifying unknown remains, that they're standing ready to do that. So we'll see where it goes, but yeah, that's important work, and it's one of those things I'll personally never feel or fully appreciate, just because the idea of not having the remains of a family member for so long, and knowing on with your rational mind that they're dead and gone. But the thing that I'll never quite experience or appreciate is that part that they talk about, how they can't ever sort of close the book, or closure is the word they use, however you put it. That sense of finality, like the knowing and the having the remains, and that being able to just sort of close it and have that sense of just being fully at peace with it. It's something that's so important to a lot of those people. So any opportunity I think you have to do something like that, it's great, But as I said, it's not cheap, and it is hard work, but it's really great. It was really great for me to learn that there are people willing to do it, and they're doing it 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, trying to do that.
Now, I should mention, we're not there now. It's further down the hill, but I do remember last time we came on this tour, you showed me at the bottom of the hill the dates on some of the graves. Not the ages, but the dates in which they died. And it is a hugely tragic feeling sometimes when you look at some of the dates, because the Korean War, of course, we mentioned, started in 1950, but it almost just over 3 years later. And some of the dates, you can see the dates in which people are dying. And these were, it was very much a stalemate, hill skirmishes, people fighting for one hill, then losing the hill back and forth. And you can see some of the deaths in action. And they're just a matter of days or weeks before the armistice is finally signed.
Yeah, and there's one grave that I know of, because I've noticed it, and one of the Dutch soldiers actually died on that day, the 27th of July, 1953, died on that day. And in fact, the guy who's the veteran whose grave I pointed out, the last one to be buried here, de Bowser, he was wounded in that. He was part of that unit in which those soldiers were killed. He was wounded quite seriously, recovered, but there were casualties on the last day of the war. Yeah, and when you see that, I mean,
intellectually, you know it must happen, but when you see it on the graveside, it really hits you, doesn't it?
It really does. And I, on the one hand, I mean, any death is tragic, but when you see that, the thought just occurs to you is like, just a few more hours and it was over. It's like, just missed out on going home. It is somehow especially tragic. There's a grave, in the Dutch area. I think it was 2 guys were killed on that day. The same day that de Bowser, same unit. He served in the same unit. The day he was wounded, that night of the 26th and 27th. They were on patrol and I think ambushed. A couple of them died and one went missing and a few were wounded.
Does the cemetery and people involved here ever have any, I suppose interaction is probably the wrong word because it's probably not direct, interaction with the other side, because this is the Korean War, and on the other side of it, it's not just North Korea, but it's China involved, and the Soviet Union were back in, even though they only put some pilots in. But do you ever, is there any, I suppose correspondence is too rich of a word here, but do you ever get any sort of messages from them? I'm assuming they don't come to visit, of course, the cemetery, but do you have any sort of interaction at all?
Interaction, yes. Not official. Like you said, there are no commemorations, no official visits. Not just my boss, the custodian and his predecessors have tried to just maintain informal relations with the local consulates. So, once or twice, I guess, he's had lunch with the Russian consul or the Chinese consul. But it's a very informal thing, just to maintain, I guess, friendly relations. But there's no formal relationship of any kind. No correspondence, no planning, nothing official as far as I'm aware. No.
Yeah. And for people listening, of course, we're back at the top of the cemetery where we began here. So right back at the flags where we started, and looking down the hill all the way down to the bottom of the cemetery again here.
Let me show you that box I promised to show you. You can see it.
Oh, yes. I can see it from a distance now.
Yeah, and you also notice, I mean, none of the others have that. So many Turks, as I said, were coming here and bringing things from the homeland, little pouches of soil, those little pouches that you see in there. Okay. Those are pouches of Turkish soil. They wanted to bring a bit of Turkish soil to Korea to console the spirits of the dead, of Turkish flags. You can see quite a few business cards of the various people who have come.
Are they war medals as well, those things there?
These are, they're called, these are a kind of coin. I think some call them challenge coins. And they're basically coins that a lot of dignitaries will have these sort of printed up, and they give them as gifts or mementos. It's just this is their office and their name with some kind of insignia. It's sort of like a more like a higher sort of level sort of business card exchange. Okay. It's not contact info, but it's just like to say that you are kind of a trusted sort of.
We should mention that
it's a nice little gift or a token of a meeting between two people.
All around those coins are a whole series of business cards, it looks like, as well.
Yeah, those are a lot of the people who've come to visit, and like I said, they this year being the exception. I mean, they come all the time, and for any reason, anywhere from the Turkish prime minister. There hasn't been a president here since I've been here, but in the past there have been.
Yes.
But the prime minister's been here, all the cabinet ministers, all the chiefs of the branches of the armed forces of Turkey, and everyone down to civilians, students. Occasionally I'll meet someone who'll say, "Yeah, my great uncle served in the war, and can you help me find his grave?" And they come from all over Turkey to visit. Yeah, it's really cool. And like I said, we get visitors from all of the sending states, but Turkey. I mean, I have to say, in my experience, they have just probably send again proportionally greater numbers. As I mentioned earlier, they lost proportionally more soldiers, but they seem to have a proportionally greater draw or call to visit here. I think greater affinity somehow with this place. Yeah.
So we're back at the very top now, looking down. As we said, we walked up, we're at the peak amongst the flags. So I suppose as a last question here, of course, the location is very central Busan these days, very downtown here. But of course, you're open regularly all throughout the year, and if people can come. They can't walk on the grass as we've been walking, but as we look, there's a tour going past us now. So, what is it like as a tourist destination for people listening who would like to come and see it for themselves?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great place to add to your itinerary. For anyone who's interested in history and the Korean War, I think it's really a must because it really is a unique place. And then, as I mentioned too, anyone who's just looking for a nice little breathing space from this dense, urban city, Busan, it's a great place to sort of decompress and sit, catch up with your thoughts a bit. Mm-hmm. The groups here, you see, like these are tourist groups that come fairly regularly. The gentleman leading that tour, he's a volunteer. The city of Busan sends us several volunteers every year, about 10 or so. Mm-hmm. And they do, I think, a couple of years and then rotate. And they're generally older folks like this gentleman. A lot of them are retired teachers. Mm-hmm. And they volunteer their time a couple of days a week. They come and lead tours, as this guy's doing. This looks like a group of, I'm guessing, Korean tourists, and they're going to do pay a moment of silence and pay respect. And we get all kinds of groups, from overseas as well. We get, students, young kids, families, tour groups. I think one of the tour buses actually drops people off here as well. But all are welcome. Really encourage you to visit if you're in Busan and you're looking to see a truly unique bit of Korean and I suppose world history. I'd encourage you to drop by and don't feel shy. Knock on my door. We're a small office. Just knock on my door. Yep. Come grab me if you have any questions or you want any additional information, or if you really want to walk on the grass. I'll see what I can do. Yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. So this a wonderful day for a great walking tour. And John Bocskay, thanks a lot for not just the tour, but the time and the information.
It's been my pleasure, Jed, really.